Sawadika, my name is Beko Pin, and I am in Bangkok, Thailand, covering the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation uh, Economic Leaders Meeting. But before that, a few days ago, actually, I was to talk to you via Rappler social media, and I was in Phnom Penh in Bangkok for the Association of Southeast Asian Nations uh, summit in Phnom Penh. Okay, so yung point ng discussion na ito is to talk about these summits which are happening in Southeast Asia. Hence the title, so many summits and what for. Before we talk about the summits, a quick recap on what happened in ASEAN. President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. participated in that summit. During the summit, maraming summits kasi yon. Merong leader summit, tapos meron ding summits with ASEAN allies. So we have summits like the ASEAN China Summit, the ASEAN US Summit, etc., etc. So during several of those summits, you had President Marcos of the Philippines talking about the importance of following international law and creating the code of conduct, the long-awaited code of conduct in the South China Sea during his interventions. Again, intervention, yun yung kung nagsasalita na ang head of state or head of government during the summits in the ASEAN summits, ulit-ulit ng summit. During also those summits, during his interventions, he also pushed for the Philippines bid to win a seat in the United Nations Security Council. Una niyang sinabi yun sa UNGA or sa United Nations General Assembly in New York in September. Yung pinaka-main concern ng ASEAN members ng bloc ng Southeast Asian nations is the situation in Myanmar. They issued a statement regarding that, although wala pang chairman's statement or yung statement to conclude, to summarize the agreements or the positions taken by the bloc during the summit. In the case of President Marcos, kasi nga itong mga trips na to, hindi lang naman yung summit itself, but also bilateral meetings, side meetings. May side meeting, ibig sabihin mga meeting yan with business leaders or perhaps informal meetings with certain personalities. But when you say bilateral meetings, you're talking about meetings of one head of state or head of government who is his or her or their counterpart in another country. So kapwa head of state, head of government, on the sidelines, when we say on the sidelines, outside of the summits within ASEAN. So in the case of President Marcos, he had bilateral meetings with Cambodia, Brunei, South Korea, and Canada. Side note din, although hindi tayo kasali sa side meeting na ito, nagka-side meeting din ng US, South Korea at Japan tungkol sa North Korea. Isa din yung major concern ng ASEAN members. Also, isang announcement during the summit, the ASEAN Summit in Phnom Penh, kinonfirm ng Office of the Press Secretary ng Pilipinas na magkakaroon ng state visit si President Marcos to China in 2023. We also expect a bilateral meeting between the President Marcos, and his counterpart from China, who would be Chinese President Xi Jinping, later today, actually, in a few minutes, Phnom Penh time. So yun yung more or less nangyari sa ASEAN. I'm bringing in someone else to talk to us about the summits. But before that, let's hear President Marcos himself talking about the summits and the quote-unquote commonalities of the ASEAN members.
What I learned in this, having attended this ASEAN summit, is that maraming talagang commonalities ang bawat bansa, which should not really be surprising considering that we're all around we're all from the same area. So there are very many similar problems, of course, and we talk always about recovering from the pandemic economy. We talked about preparing for the next pandemic. What do we do about the scarcity of, let's say, the prices of food, of fertilizer, energy? What are we going to do about it? What can we do about it? How do we get around it? Ano yung mga joint na pwedeng gawin para to alleviate some of the difficulties that everybody's going through?
Mukhang nagka-problema.
What I learned in this having attended.
Okay, I think we have some problems with the playback from the quote of President Marcos. That was him speaking to the media after the ASEAN summit. Actually, if you want to hear the entire interview, he was talking about ASEAN, he was talking about the South China Sea, he was talking about Myanmar. It's actually on Rappler's YouTube channel. But anyway, back to the main discussion, the bigger discussion that we have today. Ang daming summit nangyayari dito sa region ngayon, bukod sa ASEAN in Phnom Penh, katatapos lang, at yung APEC na ongoing ngayon, bukas yung economic leaders meeting, meron ding G20, although hindi tayo kasali doon sa Bali, Indonesia. Ano bang point ng mga summit na to? So to answer that question, dinamay ko sa live at sa recap na to yung DFA reporter ng Rappler, si Sofia Toma Cruz, to help us understand kung ano ba yung nakukuha natin at bang hindi natin nakukuha sa mga summits na to at bakit importante sila, so much so that heads of state and heads of government actually fly out of their countries and stay and actually visit other countries just to attend these summits and conferences. Sophia, are you there? Hello,
Okay.
Soph.
Yeah, sorry, nakamute. I'm here. Yeah, so, well, thank you for having me. But yeah, to your question about but ang daming summit. Ano ba yung purpose ng mga summits? Considering back-to-back siya, it will entail, of course, not only President Marcos, but all these different countries, heads of state, leaving their homes and coming together, no? So where we can talk about, let's say, three main reasons. I hope three to. Baka mali yung kante ko. But then, some main reasons why these summits are so important. No? Well, first things first. Of course, yung kailangan malaman din ano yung context. Well, basically, the context of the world today, where when all these summits are taking place. Unang-una, ito yung mga first in-person summits in nearly 3 years. I know, I mean, you and I have talked about this before, and it seems like everything is versed, or there's always this characterization of this is the first time leaders are meeting in how many years? This is the first time since the pandemic was declared. But we have to remember, diba, I mean, almost 3 years, and so for the last 3 years, halos virtual lahat ng mga meetings between all these world leaders, and while you can be productive online, of course things are different when it's face to face. So because these summits are the first to be held face to face and in person, and in so long, in 3 years, there's a lot of high expectations that kailangan substantial talaga yung mga discussions dito. And kailangan substantial dahil may gathering na ito ng heads of state. And as a president, as a leader of your country, your most valuable asset is your time. No?
Yeah.
Kasi ang daming problema sa mundo, literally, sa home countries ng mga presidents, that you have to make sure that summits are really worth your time. That being said, the global context today, no, aside from where I mentioned, one, the world is slowly exiting from the pandemic. So you have this big issue about post-pandemic recovery. And then you also have other issues like food security, climate change, na every day it's becoming more and more urgent. You have Myanmar, like you mentioned a while ago, and how the 5-point consensus that ASEAN put together when the crisis broke out there hasn't been met. No, I mean, I think that was a pretty much unanimous statement among in the regional bloc that there has been no progress in 5-point consensus. You also have the issue of Taiwan, tensions that are increasing there, and that had flared earlier this month. Sorry, not this month, earlier this year, when China basically flashed or put on display its military capabilities to take over Taiwan should the need ever arise. And you also have we also have looming in the background, the ongoing war in Ukraine, which everybody is affected by, not only when it comes to peace and stability, worldwide, but also things like um, food security, like I mentioned earlier,
Yeah.
and how earlier in the early days of the war and up until now, um, everybody was affected because it um, impacted oil prices. No, the most
Yeah.
important commodity right now for one
Yeah.
of the most important commodities right now for mankind. And aside from that, we also have the threat of missiles from North Korea, and of
Yeah.
course, we have the South China Sea issue. So, ang daming issues na ba, like I just listed, and all of
Yeah.
these are very, very urgent. Um, all all of which needs to be prioritized by world leaders. And so these summits provide an opportunity for heads of state to come together to talk about that. Talk
Mm.
about the situation right now in the world. Talk about ano ba yung kailangan natin gawin, ano pa yung saan pa tayo kulang, ano ba yung plano natin to address all these things. And kumbaga parang it's a time to come together to coordinate and
Yeah.
plan. Um, get everyone on the same page in discussing all these issues, charting out a plan, roadmap for where the world is going to go. So you can't have
Yeah.
that, no, without these summits,
Yeah.
providing a venue for leaders to gather, and you can't have that virtually. I mean, just imagine, diba? Yung parang just imagine the kind of logistics it takes to schedule um, X number of world leaders gathering in one
Yeah.
place.
Yeah.
I would argue na mahirap din gawin yun over Zoom, diba? Or like
Yeah.
virtually. So
Yeah.
these in-person summits are also really important. Um, and it's important that because all these world leaders are gathering, that the Philippines sends its high is also represented at the highest levels for these discussions. And there's no other leader who is higher than President Marcos.
Yeah.
Um, so that's one point. And then two also, um, kahit mga regional summit to, ASEAN, APEC, these are also opportunities to gather other world leaders, no?
Yeah.
Kagaya ng si US President Joe Biden, Chinese President Xi Jinping, other leaders from all over the world, Australia, Canada, Japan, South Korea, even the UN, di ba, sa ASEAN.
Yeah.
Um, and so with the context of all these pressing global issues happening, um, a lot of people look to these summits as well as kind of demonstrating and also in a way testing ASEAN's ability to be able to diffuse tensions, bridge leaders from all over the world, and provide a platform and a venue for discussion and in-person meetings. No? If you notice, even in the past, things like APEC, ASEAN, was always this gathering where you have leaders from Southeast Asia, you have leaders from East Asia, you have leaders from the Pacific, you have leaders from the US and Europe who come together to talk about the most pressing, urgent issues. Now, there's not a lot of venues, I think,
Mm.
that meeting takes place. And so when you always hear this phrase, no, I'm sure you heard this Phnom Penh, ASEAN centrality. That's kind of what that's what they mean. That's what a lot of leaders in Southeast Asian countries and ASEAN members mean by that. No, we want to be this venue where leaders can come together and where we can help foster dialogue to solve all the world's pressing issues and problems. So,
Mm.
because if you don't dialogue, then it leads to things like conflict. Um,
Mm.
that being said, kailangan din na may mga concrete deliverables from these summits. Hindi pwede na mag-meeting-meeting lang kayo, dinners, banquets, because there's so much because there's so many because there's such high expectations attached to these meetings, and because
Yeah.
the problems the world is facing is so urgent. Kailangan may plan talaga, diba? Which
Mm.
is also why what you mentioned earlier, things like statements, are also really important because that's where we see ano ba yung naging outcome ng mga meetings
Yeah.
ng world leaders. Otherwise, um, that's also how we know that these summits were worth president's time, taxpayers' money
Yeah.
from several countries, um, and also I suppose that that the urgent problems the world is facing will actually be met. So siguro dun lang tayo muna just to talk about
Yeah.
bakit nga ba may daming bakit mga ang daming summits and
Yeah.
why it's even worth attending.
Yeah. To add in pala, I mentioned G20, I mentioned ASEAN and APEC. There's also COP27, not in this region. Obviously, it's in Egypt, pero that's a really long summit, weeks long siya. But that also connects to the major issue of climate change, right? Which is also being discussed, which was also discussed at ASEAN, and we expect that for sure to be discussed as well during the economic leaders meeting bukas dito
Yeah.
sa Bangkok, Thailand. If you're wondering pala, iba-iba yung term sa mga summits na to. So sa ASEAN, dahil pupunta ka doon as a political entity, as a state, so head of government or head of state ka. Dito sa APEC, ang Pangulo or ang Prime Minister, they come here as the head of economy kasi yung discussion sa APEC ay about the economy. Pero on the sidelines of APEC, syempre you'll hear discussions outside the economy na, although they kind of still affect the economy, right? Like obviously regional stability, food security, things like that. Magka-dugtong-dugtong yun. Siguro to add din to Sophia, kasi ako naman, kung si Soph, matagal na nagka-cover ng DFA ako, hindi talaga ako nag-cover ng diplomacy. So it's quite dizzying to hear these diplomatic terms of centrality, like what does centrality even mean. Pero siguro so gusto ko lang pag-usapan a little bit yung consensus is very important, or is this the point of ASEAN, right? Pero consensus sometimes leads you nowhere, or parang it leads you down a really long path. In the example kunwari of the code of conduct of the South China Sea, 20-year anniversary na niya, wala pa rin tayo. 20-year anniversary ng declaration rather, wala pa rin code of conduct. Paano mo, quick question lang siguro, no? Parang paano mo ma-weigh yun na parang we have all these summits na mahal, by the way, for the host country and even the delegations flying into the host country, right? Kasi you have to think about the expenses of the whole delegation. Kasi when the president travels or when the prime minister travels, it's not just him, her, or them traveling. That's a whole delegation with you. So how do you balance yung concept na yun? It's worth it to attend these summits, but also, like, sometimes these summits you don't reach consensus. Therefore, wala. We'll talk about it again in the coming years, coming months, ganun.
I think that goes tama nga no, Bea. I think that well that's always that's one big criticism of ASEAN is that consensus is
Yeah.
holding them. Perfect example you mentioned was the code of conduct in the South China
Yeah.
Sea. Pati na rin yung issue sa Myanmar.
Yeah.
Criticism that the statement wasn't strong enough, or for a statement to become a statement. For
Yeah.
any statement to be released, for any joint statement to take place, kailangan na may consensus or agreement from all the members and all the participants. That's really hard to get. No, if you can
Yeah.
imagine several countries, all with their own national interests, all
Yeah.
with their own views of certain issues, having to agree on on a statement, no,
Yeah.
or just like a plan forward.
Yeah.
Um, so you can look at it two ways. Yeah, it is one thing that's really held ASEAN back. Some people would argue. But in another way, if you look at the other side of that, when consensus is reached, then it's strong. Then you know
Yeah.
that there's unanimous support, no. But to your point, I think we can go back to what I mentioned earlier, um, na that's why it's so important to see things like joint statements, and that's why it's
Yeah.
so important that there's actual deliverables and outcomes that come from these meetings. Um, otherwise, then it's just you want to show your people from around in the region and around the world who elected these leaders and who give taxes and pay for all these summits,
Yeah.
that's worth their money as well.
Yeah.
Um, I think it's also why, just to your point about consensus, that's also why ASEAN is, well, some people argue na siguro dapat wala nang consensus sa ASEAN.
Yeah.
But then consensus is almost part and partial with the ASEAN identity. You can
Mm-mm.
um, it's hard to imagine ASEAN in a way without consensus because that's basically what they stand for. No, now you can come here and you will be able to dialogue. We will provide you with a platform to discuss very pressing issues. We will be a bridging. We will be a bridging force. And if you do away with things like consensus, I
Yeah.
guess in a way it makes it more difficult for them to play that
Yeah.
role.
For sure. For sure. Dagdag lang dun sa backstory of how hard it is to reach consensus. Like when we were in Phnom Penh, kumausap sa amin isang opisyal ng DFA, si ASEC Imperial, if I'm not mistaken. Nung kinausap niya kami, sabi niya nahihirapan maghanap ng consensus on Myanmar. So okay yung 5-point consensus from 2021, okay yun, pero there were disagreements over who to engage, how to engage, tapos yung mode of consensus. So, walang consensus sa mode of consensus. That interview happened around, I think, I want to say noon or a little after noon. So, after that interview, he left for another meeting and then he came back mga 3 p.m. to say na while I was giving your interview, we actually reached a consensus. So, ganun din siya ganun din ka bilis at kabagal minsan, yung pag-reach ng consensus na to or yung paghanap ng point of agreement ng mga nations. And later on, President Marcos, when he spoke to the media, told us na there were, without naming who among the ASEAN, who in the bloc, there were voices who wanted to Myanmar to be out of the bloc, no? So ganun ka-extreme din yung range of positions sa mga tao. Some of the members did not want to talk to the generals at all. The Philippine position, as expounded by the president, is that we want to talk to all sectors involved. So from the junta, hindi yun ginagamit na term ni President Marcos. So from the military generals down to, hindi na rin sinabi opposition, pero what he wants to do, or what our stand as a country is that we want to talk to everyone. May iba na ayaw mag-engage at all. So ganun kahirap yung iba't ibang discussions na ito. It's a very fascinating world. But so we won't expound on that anymore. Bukod sa summits, yung pinag-usapan nga natin kanina, marami mga tinatawag nilang bilateral meetings. In fact, one is gonna happen in a few minutes from now between the Philippines and China. So we expect that to be President Marcos and Chinese President Xi Jinping, although wala pang pictures, obviously, yung nirelease with that meeting. Before we talk about bilateral meetings, let's listen quickly to our interview with President Marcos earlier from Phnom Penh about the bilateral meetings.
There are many times they're also useful were yung formal na bilateral, yung naka-schedule na bilateral na meron din yung basta hihilahin mo yung isa, ano ba yung sinasabi mo, ganito ba, pwede naman tulungan tayo. So it's always very useful to have a face-to-face with an agreement or all that. It's just talagang pakiramdaman mo na ano ba talagang problema? What do you want? What do I want? What can we do together? What are the things that we cannot do? All of that. That's really what the bilaterals are for. In terms of the bilaterals, you don't really come away.
Gusto ko I think there's another quote, but you can watch the full interview. It's up on Rappler's YouTube channel. Gusto ko yung nag-intro na rin si President Marcos sa mga meetings na nangyayari on the sidelines of these summits. So, nabanggit natin kanina na yung bilateral meeting, yun talaga yung formal, may mga flag ng bawat bansa, may panel yan, may mga counterparts yan, pero nabanggit din kanina sa interview na yun, yung informal, yung hihilain mo lang literally. So, kasi may mga breaks yung summits, diba? So, sometimes you'll see heads of state, heads of government pulling each other, hindi man literal na pull, pero magkikita sila in one corner. Tapos very, very quick conversation, literally 2 minutes, 3 minutes, ganun, or minsan seconds lang. It might look silly to some people, but parang iba rin yung value of these face-to-face interactions between world leaders. So ano ba yung point ng bilateral meeting? Although na-explain na ng kaunti through that soundbite kanina from President Marcos.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, sa soundbite ni President Marcos, yun yung point talaga, no? Basically, to meet your counterpart face-to-face and to discuss, kumbaga, so, ano ba talaga? Like, ano ba yung gusto mo? Ito yung gusto ko. Okay, yun yung bawal sa'yo. Okay, ito yung bawal sa akin. To know one another's intentions and to have a better understanding of each other's positions. And again, you can look at it as, some people look at it as, ano ba yan? Puro talk, no action. But, when it comes to things like or diplomacy, which we can also talk about, which you can also apply to your earlier question on about summits, there's always a say that, face-to-face interactions really are so crucial. It's very hard to face. And that being said, yung mga bilaterals between heads of state, where they can discuss the full breadth of the current state of relations. So, for example, between the Philippines and China, kasi yun yung ongoing / upcoming bilateral. It will be important because it's the first face-to-face meeting between President Xi Jinping and President Marcos. And as a new administration in the Philippines, that's where you kind of set the tone of your relations. Na that's kind of where you set the tone of your relations. If you can recall before, no, sa time ni President Duterte, these are where supposed agreements took place, or where they kind of defined red lines when it comes to, for instance, yung West Philippine Sea issue. Kumbaga, okay, this is where President Duterte mentioned na parang, okay, we came to an agreement that fishermen from both countries can fish in these waters, and that Filipino fishermen should be able to access Scarborough Shoal, yung mga ganun. And while these discussions do take place on different levels in the government, like the DPAs, the DNR, Coast Guard, things like that, iba pa rin kasi kung galing sa taas, diba?
Yeah.
Kung galing sa highest level, because then everything follows going down.
Yeah.
Then another, to that point as well, dialogue is also important, especially and in spite of disagreements, because that's how you manage tensions and that's how you manage relations. Diba? Imagine kung may kaaway ka, and tensions are rising, baka may conflict na, or conflict would break out and everything. Meeting each other face to face, and again, talking about things like, what do you want? What do I want? What's a red line to you? What's a red line to me? Those things can bring the heat down. And I guess in that way, because you dialogue and because you do those things, you're able to manage relations as well. But that being said, again, hindi sapat na puro bilaterals lang. These should always be complemented with efforts sa multilateral level, like the UN, and the regional level, like ASEAN, and also your bilateral meetings and relations with other countries. So kung may bilateral meeting ka with China, nag-bilateral meeting si President Marcos with US President Joe Biden, and all the different leaders that you mentioned earlier, Bea.
Yeah. And siguro to zoom out also, yung maybe people are wondering, bakit parang mas big deal yung ibang bilateral parang a bilateral with the Southeast Asian nation perhaps is not as big of a deal. as with China and US. Well, first of all, kasi superpowers, they're two, like West and like, global North, and then this side of the world, sila yung superpowers nga. And then, syempre, there's the tension between the US and China, di ba? In ano bang proper terms of ikaw mag-supply sa akin ng proper
Rivalry,
term.
competition. Oh,
There,
yung parang competition nila. Which you can talk about. I mean, isang example din no, Bea, kung gaano ka-importante or valuable din yung bilateral meetings between presidents is just the one that happened a few days ago between President Joe Biden and President Xi Jinping, no? Aside from the US and aside from China, other countries were watching that too, Philippines included,
yeah,
because everybody's being affected by the intense competition, no? And
yeah,
so there was a lot of, again, expectations and hopes tied to that meeting, that when the two leaders finally meet face to face, that
mm-mm,
it'll set perhaps yung parang guardrails sa
yeah,
competition nila, in that it could kind of bring down the tension that was taking place between the two countries. And everybody's always scared that conflict will break out either intentionally or accidentally,
yeah,
which is avoidable by talking to each other,
yeah.
which is really what the whole what diplomacy is all about. No? It's like always, parang may joke din minsan na, yeah, well, dialogue to no end, but that's also how you keep the world peaceful, stable, kumbaga.
So yun. Actually, so para lang if I'm not mistaken, the meeting is supposed to happen at 5:30
Mm.
Bangkok time. So that's a few minutes from now actually. We expect them to meet on the
Mm.
sidelines of the APEC summit. Confirmed that Xi Jinping is in Bangkok currently. Also, gusto ko lang idagdag pala yung nabanggit ni Sofia na bilateral between the US and China. Bilateral meetings, hindi allowed ang media mag-sit in, obviously, sa buong meeting. Although, I just want to note na on the sidelines of the ONGA in New York, um, yung Philippine-Japan na bilateral, photo spray lang, which means we literally just take pictures of the two leaders shaking hands and saying hi to each other, as opposed to the US and Philippine na bilateral, na opening statements, hinayaan yung commercial media yung term nila. So, hindi yung state-run media or hindi yung bit-bit na media as in like White House comms or the Palace comms. They allowed commercial media to cover the opening statement. So, medyo, it also, so yung liberality in what the media is allowed to cover also depends on which country you're talking to. I believe in the case of China with the bilateral later, very limited, walang commercial media who are are allowed to cover. Hence why I'm here inside the hotel as the bilateral happens. And also, dagdag ko lang na yung US. So, how do we find out what happens in the bilateral meetings? In yung term sa Philippines is a press release. So may PR na ilalabas yung Office of the Press Secretary. In the White House, the term is a readout. So parang press release din siya in a way, pero parang notes, tama ba? Parang notes siya of what was discussed. And I just want to highlight that the readout for the US-China bilateral was really, really long, as opposed to the readout for the US-Philippine bilateral, which is like 3 paragraphs, 4 paragraphs long. Ito sobrang haba. It was reportedly a 3-hour meeting. So little things about the bilateral meeting between the two superpowers of the world right now.
In a way, din ba, just a really final,
Yeah,
just one small point to add, no.
yeah,
Yung bilaterals din, in a way demonstrates, kumbaga, I guess the level or the priority or the
mm,
or the view or the weight a certain relation has.
yeah,
Certain relations,
yeah.
I mean, wait, sorry,
No,
na-drama yung terms in my head.
yeah,
Yeah, basically, it's also one way to look at how countries view each other and
yeah,
their role, like, parang the level of relations with each other. Kasi
yeah,
again, going back to my point earlier, um, all these world leaders have so many things to do that their the most valuable asset is time. So if they set aside
Yeah.
time to meet with one another, it's of course important.
Tapos dagdag din na background, baka magtaka kayo, bakit minsan kasi, kunwari, the media covering a president, I'm sure this also happens to other countries or other press corps who cover a president or head of state. Sinasabihan kami beforehand na may ganitong bilateral na baka mangyari. But oftentimes we're asked to embargo or to not report on it yet because nangyayari na may nakakancel na bilateral. Minsan, dramatic yung reason, baka may nag-back out or whatever, but sometimes it's really just a matter of logistics. Like literally, the counterpart of one country or the head of state, head of government of one country can't make it for many reasons. Like there's one meeting is running late, or maybe the traffic in a city is crazy, hindi makaabot sa meeting point dapat. So, may mga ganong nuances yung mga bilateral meetings. So in this case, we were briefed. There was a hint that a bilateral would happen on the sidelines of APEC, pero officials wouldn't confirm it. Siguro kasi the scheduling is quite difficult because they're usually here for a limited amount of time, the heads of state and heads of government. So yun nga, like what Soph said, the fact na siningit or ginawa ng schedule ang isang tao during a relatively quick visit to say Bangkok says a lot also nga about the importance of that
Siguro,
country.
siguro Bea, just a very quick question, no? Or kumbaga, review of the leaders President Marcos is supposed to have bilaterals with while he's in Bangkok. So we know, of course, bilateral with President Xi Jinping is supposedly taking place in a few minutes. But are there any other? Are there any other?
Yung briefing ng DFA was we expect up to 6 bilateral meetings.
Okay.
I think may iba na postpone or na hold for one reason or another. Like there's one particular there's one particular block that President Marcos was supposed to meet all the way back pa in New York, pero siguro naurong. Not for malicious reasons, but siguro it was really just a scheduling conflict. Kasi medyo, I mean, to add din pala to the cost of these summits, bukod sa cost of the hosting country and putting up venues, like you have thousands of reporters, journalists flying in to cover the summit, the delegations of each head of state. Dagdag pa din yung hassle that you're bringing upon the host city. Like in Thailand, maraming streets na closed in full or partially for different stretches of the day because of the summits. Because you have heads of state, heads of government flying in here. Ganun din sa Phnom Penh. May mga sections of the city na talagang walang traffic-free. And I'm told by friends from Cambodia na hindi naman yun yung normal. So parang sa atin lang, when we hosted APEC or ASEAN, parang parts of Metro Manila had to be shut down for a while because of the heads of state, heads of government visiting and for the summit. So yun lang, konting context lang for that. So yun, wala pa tayong balita actually kung ano pa bang mga side meetings mangyayari dito in Bangkok. But normally we find out a day before. That's when we're told na may bilateral pala. For example, yung Brunei it was only confirmed I think a day before on the sidelines of the ASEAN. So yung na-confirm talaga, Manila pa lang was obviously Cambodia as the ASEAN chairman and the host of the summit, and South Korea. Tapos yung other two countries. Na-mention ni President Marcos si Macron, France. Hindi pa yun nangyayari. Pero I think parang clearly we're close to pinning a date, I guess. Kasi nabanggit na niya in a chance interview that he is keen or there are, kumbaga, nakalatag na yung plano for them to meet each other. So yung pinakamalaking bilateral, yung pinakamalaking bilateral today that we were expecting, China obviously, it's the lead up to a state visit. Syempre, like nabanggit ko kanina, iba-iba yung degrees ng pagka-big deal ng isang state visit. Sayo ko ito itatanong siguro, no? Nabanggit na kasi ni President Marcos before and he wants to bring up the South China Sea, West Philippine Sea issue if and when he talks to President Xi Jinping. Dinownplay ni Speaker Romualdez, the cousin of the president earlier, when we asked him about the bilateral meeting, sabi niya, since it's the sidelines of APEC, Malamang daw economic issues yung pag-uusapan. But we all know, hindi naman porket APEC nangyari, economic issues yung pag-uusapan ng dalawang leaders, di ba? Unusual ba for a president, for let's say President Marcos to bring up what is arguably a touchy topic before his counterpart from China?
Well, hindi siya unusual. In fact, kailangan.
Yeah.
Kailangan na mabanggit yung issue na yan. But then, I mean, like you mentioned, Obea, the main reason why all these leaders are there is APEC, and there is a state visit coming up in January. So we would expect it would be interesting if President Marcos brings up the issue of the South China Sea and the West Philippine Sea in this, well, currently ongoing bilateral. But an issue like that, you can imagine, kailangan ng mahabang discussion. Lalo na kasi ito yung unang meeting ni Marcos and Xi. And so you just talked about the fact na may scheduling conflict minsan, or talagang limited yung time sa mga for these sideline bilateral meetings. So while it would be very interesting, and in fact should be raised, I think that the issue should be raised. Hindi siya unusual. May possibility din na baka ma-raise lang ni Marcos in not necessarily in passing, but in brief. Perhaps as an opening for further discussion when I see you in January. Because well, you also consider things like parang okay, first meeting lang natin to, so hello, hi, let's not rock the boat too much yet. There's also that kind of finesse, or I would say that's where the diplomatic style of President Marcos will come in, which we are just only beginning to kind of see and learn about. So it would be interesting if he raises it, but you can imagine na yung mas meaty and substantial na discussion baka sa January pa.
For sure. Kumbaga parang ano to.
Pero may mga teaser ba si House Speaker Romualdez on what will be discussed?
He tried to emphasize economic talks, so mga siguro one thing that President Marcos keeps emphasizing, private-public deals business-wise. He's also pushing for government-to-government deals. And again, siguro, although nabanggit na natin ito kanina, no, parang si President Marcos mismo nagsabi he's the new kid. He obviously only assumed his post in June. So, parang yung tama ka nga, sabi nga niya, his bilateral with Canada was mostly an introduction because they had never ever met before. So, just introducing himself. So, kumbaga, if the ONGA was to introduce himself to the diplomatic world, ASEAN and APEC back-to-back is him introducing himself to the region and the allies of the regional bloc in the case of ASEAN, and also sa APEC na din, diba?
In a way din, continuation din ng introduction niya to the world, no? Kasi like you mentioned sa ONGA, ang daming ganap, ang daming activities, so you can't meet everyone there. So, continuation ng introduction niya, so to say, to all these different leaders. I think just one last point to raise, and may question din ako for you, Bea. But itong specific bilateral meeting between President Marcos and President Xi is also important. I guess because that's where we're going to start seeing how the tone of Philippine-Chinese relations is going to be under a Marcos presidency. You can take that in, taking into account siguro two things, no? History, being the successor of former President Rodrigo Duterte, with whom ties with China flourished in a way, but flourished in the sense that President Duterte really prioritized warmer ties with China, but also opened us up to a lot of to a whole other host of issues. So we'll start to see what President Marcos's China policy will look like, how he might set the tone of relations at that level, which of course will follow down. And I think that's kind of what I wanted to ask you too, Nobea. So far, at least from because you cover President Marcos and you've been following him since he has entered Malacanang, may indicators or signs ba kumbaga, on what that relationship might look like, or ano ba yung mga inclination niya? Kasi I think yun din yung isang tanong ng mga analysts and experts, something that they're watching and waiting
Yeah,
to figure out. Ano ba yung style niya? Ano ba yung
yeah.
tone niya?
I think he's very sincere and serious about the whole friend to all, enemy to none approach niya. Sabi nga niya, paano ba tayo mag-negotiate sa China? Bilateral, multilateral or bilateral? Sabi niya, lahat ng laterals. We want all options. So talagang medyo hindi siya as, kumbaga, the way I described it was kung the late President Aquino naging cold yung relationship natin with China. Kung kay Duterte talagang he wanted to pivot towards China, ito medyo pagitna. And you also have to contextualize, diba, when he went to New York for the UNGA, his like the way that he hyped up and kumbaga what's the diplomatic term for that? Emphasize the relationship or the importance of the relationship of the Philippines and the US. So there he goes mending the low point, between Philippine and US relations during the previous president, Rodrigo Duterte. So mandun din. And then siguro we can, if I don't know, I hope we can link it here or sa tweets or wherever, or you can search it na lang. Sophia has an excellent piece about diplomacy and President Marcos Jr., how the history of the first President Marcos shadows or tints the diplomacy, that the diplomatic side of the current President Marcos. Kasi for example, kanina, actually si Speaker Romualdez mismo nag-emphasize na it was the first President Marcos, the strongman, the late dictator, who re-established ties with China. Ayun din yung small talk. What a small talk na. Yun yung small talk ni President Marcos sa Chinese premier in Phnom Penh. Parang nag-nostalgia trip sila na parang they remember na parang ganon. It was the first President Marcos who kumbaga re-established ties with China, etc., etc. So parang yeah, yun din. And then I think one interesting thing is that part of although we don't have confirmation from Malacanang kung officially part siya ng delegation, but former President Gloria Macapagal Arroyo is in Bangkok as well. She sat in the front row actually during the CEO summit kasi nagsalita si President Marcos. So interesting yun because, well, the former president was known to have very good ties with China when she was the head of state of the Philippines. So, we'll see. I mean, the fact na kasama niya si former President Arroyo, di ba? Of all the summits that he's attended, why bring her here or invite her to join the APEC meeting in the working visit to Bangkok, Thailand, during which he's expected to hold a bilateral with China. So, there are things like that na interesting. I don't know.
Yeah, kasi economist din si GMA, di ba?
Yeah.
Yeah. But also just to really quickly add to your point, Nabea, I mentioned history a while ago. I forgot to mention, I mentioned two things, but I forgot to mention, aside from President Duterte's ties, the way he set ties to China. Of course, the fact that, like you mentioned, there's a personal history between Marcos and China. Marcos, both President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. and his father, that both sides like to constantly hark back to. And President Marcos himself, the current President Marcos himself, we remember also went to China with his mother for that famous meeting with Mao Zedong.
Yeah. So yun din, may history din nakasama. Read Sophia's piece. It's interesting when you see when they choose to bring up the legacy or the memory of the first President Ferdinand Marcos. Kasi talking about bilaterals, it was also brought up during the bilateral with Brunei. Kasi nung naunan lang ng 2 or 3 taon si Ferdinand Marcos Sr. na nanalo sa first term niya as president kay the Sultan of Brunei when he assumed the Sultanate. So, That's also a note of which how long the Sultan has been in power in Brunei. Pero may ganun ding discussion and may memories of the current president, President Ferdinand Marcos Jr., accompanying his father to visit Brunei when his father was head of state. So there you
I
go, the
think
history.
just to sorry, really, just
Go
paano
ahead,
pa
go ahead.
talaga. So I
Yeah.
mean, parang if you one can ask, okay, pero ano ba yung point kung mag-trip down memory lane kayo, di ba?
Yeah.
These things just foster a warmth,
Yeah.
which sometimes makes a difference when it comes to conducting and managing your relations. No, parang the ability to be able to bring up difficult topics. You can do that when you when you have a warmer relations, more cordial
Mhm.
relations, more familiarity with each other. Na parang, which is why I guess there's always this impulse to bring up the good times in the
Mm.
past. So,
Oo. Siyempre, hindi naman pwede kung mag-meet kayo. I mean, in the case of Brunei, wala naman sobrang contentious issue, but hindi naman pwede na, kumbaga, cold open ka, di ba? Siyempre, you want to warm each other up, butter each other up even. But that's not saying that that's happening now in the bilateral between the Philippines and China. But, parang, that is what is interesting to me about diplomacy, because it has all these protocols, but at the end of the day, you rely on human to human interaction to hopefully settle things and get things done. Um, yeah. And Sophia can talk more about the diplomatic world, but bibitawan na muna natin siya. Thank you for the hour-long discussion. Thank you for joining me. Um, and we'll see Sophia soon. Siya naman yung magre-report in a month? No.
no,
No, a little over
and
a little over a month to report on when President Marcos visits China for a state visit. Thank you again, Sophia, for joining us.
thank you, yeah.
And ako ulit, maiksi lang to. So again, I'm in Bangkok, Thailand for the APEC economic leaders meeting that's happening tomorrow. Although kanina nagka-events na, I mean, ilang araw na actually may events ang APEC. Pero kanina, President Marcos was sat in the panel of the CEO summit that's part of APEC, where he talked about yung the bloc or the region, the Asia Pacific region, the economies in the Asia Pacific overcoming the past difficulties. So you're talking about COVID. So obviously COVID-19, post-COVID-19 recovery, I know that term will make some people cringe, but that is one major talk point of economic leaders here in APEC, how we're gonna move forward. Yung parating discussion actually, kanina pa lang sa panel with President Marcos, was how we are no longer in a 2019 world. Of course, they're referring to the state of the world, state of our economies before the pandemic. Parang paulit-ulit na emphasis yun. We're no longer operating in that world, in that universe, which is why we need a different approach. Yung in-emphasize ni President Marcos earlier, let me bring up the story lang, three things in in order to prevent the economic downturns of recent years, for many reasons. To clarify, hindi lang naman COVID-19, but obviously COVID-19, the pandemic, was a huge factor behind those economic hardships. First of all, he emphasized climate change, and pointing out that the Philippines is among the countries that stands to lose the most as an effect of climate change. He specifically brought up yung potential loss in GDP gains. But beyond that, obviously, like any Filipino knows about the difficulties of the loss of life and economic opportunity, not just talking about GDP numbers, the economic opportunity of farmers and just the average Filipino because of the calamities brought about by intensified storms, or storms that are more intense than usual. Second, he also talked about the need to improve global health systems. So again, hindi lang naman si President Marcos, he isn't the only one who's talking about this, but preparing the world not just for the ongoing threat of COVID-19. Again, people say post-COVID, but really the threat is still out there, obviously. So it's not just addressing COVID-19 and the variants of COVID, but also any possible pandemic, because yun nga, parang yung consensus is it's not na if it will happen, it's not if, but when it might happen again. And we don't want another global shutdown brought about by disease. And also, finally, nabanggit din ni Sophia kanina, food security. This is a good quote from the president. The problem of food security is felt by every household, by every family, by everyone. The issues that the world faces now, from climate change to inflation to war, are viewed by the ordinary Filipino through the lens of food security. I think that touches on a very good point. Now, these summits, Sophia and I discussed it for over an hour. No, yung parang the importance of diplomacy, face-to-face discussions between heads of state, heads of government, or foreign ministers actually. Pero parang at the end of the day, I think what everyone in these summits and in these meetings need to think about is how their discussions actually affect the ordinary person, Filipino in our case, the ordinary citizen, who clearly does not necessarily follow closely these summits and meetings. So that's it from Bangkok for now. Again, a bilateral between the Philippines and China is actually, I think, if I'm not mistaken, ongoing. We'll get news from that maybe in a few hours. We'll give you updates kung ano pa ba mga bilateral or side meetings mangyayari dito sa Bangkok as the days progress. President Marcos will be here in Thailand until the 19th. So stick to Rappler. We'll give you updates as soon as they come our way. This has been Beko Pin. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you around soon. Bye.